courtroom fell silent as DeAndre Mitchell's laughter echoed off the mahogany walls. His attorney, dressed in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, leaned back with an amused smirk. Across the aisle, I stood alone. No lawyer, no backup, just me and a worn leather briefcase that had seen better days. My husband's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he whispered something to his legal team, and they all shared a knowing chuckle. They thought this was over before it even began. They thought I was just another desperate housewife clinging to scraps. What they didn't know was that I had spent the last 6 months preparing for this exact moment, and the storm I was about to unleash would wipe that smirk off his face permanently. Before we dive into how this courtroom showdown unfolded, I need you to do something for me. If you're enjoying this story and you want to see how karma catches up with people who underestimate others, hit that subscribe button right now. And here's the thing, I'm genuinely curious about where all of you are watching from. Are you in Georgia, sipping sweet tea while you listen to this? Maybe you're in New York, on your lunch break. Manchester, dealing with that unpredictable weather. Or perhaps you're all the way in the Netherlands, winding down for the evening. Drop a comment and let me know your location. I love seeing how this community spans the globe. And if you think this story is about to get intense, give this video a like. Trust me, you'll want to remember where you were when you heard what happens next. My name is Yvette Chambers. Well, it used to be Yvette Chambers Mitchell. But I dropped that second part the day I filed for divorce. For 15 years, I built a life with a man I thought was my partner, my confidant, my equal. DeAndre Mitchell was a real estate developer with big dreams and an even bigger ego. When we met at a community fundraiser in Atlanta back in 2008, he was charming, ambitious, and made me feel like I was the only woman in the room. I was working as a legal assistant at a small firm, putting myself through night classes to finish my paralegal certification. He would joke that I was too smart for my own good, and that one day I'd probably end up running circles around him. Turns out, that joke was more prophetic than either of us realized. We got married in 2009, right before the economy started showing signs of recovery. DeAndre's business began to take off. He started with small residential projects, flipping houses in transitioning neighborhoods, buying distressed properties and turning them into rental units. I supported him every step of the way. I used my legal knowledge to review contracts, spent weekends helping him scout properties, and even dipped into my modest savings when things got tight. I believed in us. I believed in the vision we were building together. By 2015, Mitchell Development Group was pulling in 7 figures annually. We moved from our modest townhouse in East Point to a sprawling 5-bedroom home in Cascade Heights. DeAndre bought himself a Mercedes, upgraded his wardrobe, and started attending exclusive real estate investor conferences. I was happy for him, proud even. I had finally completed my paralegal certification and was working at a mid-sized law firm downtown, specializing in contract law and real estate litigation. The irony of that specialization wouldn't be lost on me later, but success changed DeAndre. Or maybe it just revealed who he'd always been underneath that charming exterior. The man who used to hold my hand during Sunday morning walks started coming home later and later. Business dinners became weekend trips. Weekend trips became weeks away. When I'd ask about his schedule, he'd wave me off with vague explanations about investor meetings and project site visits. I wanted to trust him. I wanted to believe that this was just the price of success, that once things settled down, we'd get back to being us. I was naive. The first real crack in our marriage appeared in early 2023. DeAndre came home one evening, loosened his tie, and announced that he wanted to restructure some of our assets. He said it was for tax purposes and liability protection. He wanted me to sign papers transferring my name off several properties we'd purchased together during the early years of our marriage. He assured me it was just a formality, that it didn't change anything between us. He had his accountant and lawyer back him up, both of them nodding along as if this was the most normal thing in the world. Something in my gut told me to slow down, to read every line, to question everything. But DeAndre had a way of making me feel like I was being paranoid, like I was holding him back with my small-minded thinking. So I signed. God help me, I signed those papers without fully understanding what I was giving up. I trusted my husband more than I trusted my own instincts, and that trust would cost me dearly. By mid-2023, DeAndre was barely home. When he was around, he was distant, irritable, always on his phone. I'd catch him smiling at text messages, then quickly putting his phone face down when I entered the room. The intimacy we'd shared had evaporated. We were roommates at best, strangers at worst. I threw myself into my work, telling myself that this was just a rough patch, that all marriages went through phases like this. Then came the night that shattered everything. It was a Friday in September 2023. I'd had a particularly brutal week at work, back-to-back depositions, a difficult client, and a case that had gone sideways at the last minute. I came home exhausted, looking forward to a quiet evening. Maybe a glass of wine and a mindless movie. DeAndre's car wasn't in the driveway, which wasn't unusual. I assumed he was out with his business associates, doing whatever it was he did during those mysterious evening hours. I went upstairs to change, and that's when I noticed his home office door was slightly ajar. DeAndre was obsessive about that office. He always kept it locked when he wasn't in there. But that night, in his rush to leave, he must have forgotten. I pushed the door open, not really looking for anything in particular, just curious about why it was unlocked. His desk was its usual mess of papers, coffee cups, and sticky notes. His computer was on, the screensaver bouncing across the monitor. I shouldn't have touched anything. I should have just closed the door and walked away. But something, call it intuition, call it divine intervention, made me move the mouse. The screensaver disappeared, and I found myself staring at DeAndre's email inbox. And there, in plain view, was an email chain that made my blood run cold. The emails were between DeAndre and a woman named Simone Laurent. The subject line read, "Can't wait for Turks and Caicos. Just us." I stood there, frozen, as I scrolled through months of correspondence. These weren't just business emails. They were intimate, detailed accounts of their relationship. Simone wasn't just some random woman. She was a commercial real estate broker who'd been consulting on DeAndre's recent projects. The emails revealed that they'd been involved for over 2 years. 2 years. While I was at home, supporting him, believing in our marriage, he'd been building an entire second life with someone else. But the betrayal went deeper than infidelity. As I continued reading, I discovered something far more sinister. DeAndre had been systematically moving assets out of our joint accounts and into offshore holdings. Properties I thought we owned together had been transferred to shell companies. Investment accounts I'd contributed to had been liquidated and moved. The restructuring he'd asked me to sign off on wasn't for tax purposes. It was to cut me out entirely. He was planning to divorce me and leave me with nothing. There was even an email to his attorney, dated 3 weeks prior, outlining his strategy. Need to move quickly before Yvette catches on. She's sharper than I gave her credit for, but she trusts me. That buys us time. I want the divorce papers ready by end of October. Clean break, minimal settlement. The prenup should protect most of the assets, and with the transfers we've completed, she'll have no claim to the real value. I printed everything, every email, every attachment, every incriminating document. I created a backup folder on a thumb drive and emailed copies to myself at 3 different email addresses. Then I closed everything out, made sure the office looked exactly as I'd found it, and went downstairs. My hands were shaking, my heart was racing, but my mind was crystal clear. I'd spent years working in legal offices, watching lawyers strategize, learning how cases were built. I knew what I needed to do. I didn't confront DeAndre that night, or the next day, or the day after that. I played the role of the oblivious wife perfectly. I smiled when he came home. I asked about his day. I pretended everything was normal while I quietly consulted with 3 different attorneys, compiled financial records, and documented everything I could find about our marital assets. I was methodical, patient, and thorough, all the qualities that made me good at my job, now weaponized against a man who'd underestimated me for years. 3 weeks later, DeAndre made his move. He came home on a Wednesday evening with an envelope in his hand and a look on his face that was almost sympathetic. He sat me down at the kitchen table, that same table where we'd shared thousands of meals, where we'd planned our future, where I'd helped him strategize his business deals, and he slid the envelope across to me. "Yvette, we need to talk," he said, his voice taking on that rehearsed tone people use when they've practiced a speech. "I think we both know this hasn't been working for a while. We've grown apart. We want different things. I think it's time we were honest with ourselves and with each other." I opened the envelope. Divorce papers. He'd actually done it. Sitting across from me, looking almost bored, he explained how he'd already consulted with an attorney and how this would be quick and painless if I just cooperated. He reminded me about the prenuptial agreement we'd signed before getting married. An agreement drafted by his attorney that I'd signed when I was young and in love and stupid enough to believe that prenups were just formalities that would never actually matter. "You'll get the townhouse we rented out in East Point," he said, as if he were doing me a favor. "And I'll cover your moving expenses, plus $50,000 to help you get settled. I think that's more than fair considering the prenup. My attorney says we can have this finalized in 60 days if you don't make a fuss." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. This man who I'd loved, who I'd sacrificed for, who I'd built a life with, was sitting across from me offering breadcrumbs and acting like he was being generous. The townhouse he mentioned was worth maybe $200,000. The empire we'd built together, that I'd helped build, was worth over $40 million. And he was offering me $50,000 like it was a grand gesture. "I need to think about this," I said calmly, buying myself time. "This is a lot to process." He seemed relieved, probably expecting tears or anger. "Take a few days, but Yvette, don't drag this out. Don't make this ugly. We can both move on with dignity." Dignity. He wanted to talk to me about dignity while he'd been sleeping with another woman for 2 years and stealing from me for almost as long. But I smiled and nodded, playing the part he expected me to play. He left that night, probably to Simone's place, though he claimed he had an early meeting in Savannah. I waited until his car pulled out of the driveway. Then I made a phone call to an attorney I'd been secretly consulting with for the past 3 weeks. Her name was Patricia Kingston, and she was a bulldog in a Chanel suit. She specialized in high-asset divorces, particularly cases involving hidden assets and fraud. She was expensive. Her retainer alone was $25,000, but she was worth every penny. I'd liquidated some old stock options and tapped into a savings account DeAndre didn't know I had to pay her. When I walked into her office that first time, she looked at the documents I'd printed from DeAndre's computer and smiled like a shark that had just spotted blood in the water. "Mrs. Mitchell," she'd said, "your husband is either very arrogant or very stupid. Probably both. These emails alone are enough to establish fraud. The asset transfers violate multiple provisions of Georgia's equitable distribution laws. And if we can prove he deliberately hid income and assets to reduce your settlement, we can go after everything." "I want everything," I told her. "Not because I'm greedy, but because I earned it. I was there from the beginning. I helped build Mitchell Development Group, and he doesn't get to erase me like I never existed." "Then let's go to war," Patricia had replied. We spent the next 3 months building an ironclad case. Patricia hired a forensic accountant who traced every dollar DeAndre had moved. We documented his relationship with Simone, including expensive gifts he'd charged to what he thought were private credit cards. We found properties he'd purchased under shell companies, the investment accounts he'd hidden, and even discovered that he'd been skimming money from the business to fund his lifestyle with his mistress. The man who'd been so careful about locking his office door had been incredibly sloppy with his digital trail. Every transaction left a footprint, and we followed every single one. In December 2023, we filed our response to DeAndre's divorce petition. But we didn't just file a response. We filed a countersuit that included claims for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and requested a full forensic accounting of all marital assets. We also filed for temporary restraining orders to prevent him from moving or hiding any additional assets. When DeAndre's attorney received our filing, I imagine they nearly choked on their overpriced coffee. DeAndre called me that night, furious. "What the hell are you doing, Yvette? I offered you a fair deal. Now you're trying to take me to the cleaners after everything I've given you?" "Everything you've given me," I'd replied, my voice ice cold. "DeAndre, I gave you 15 years. I gave you my savings when you were struggling. I gave you my knowledge. my support, my loyalty. And you gave me betrayal, lies, and a lowball offer that insults everything we built together. So yes, I'm taking you to court, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly who you really are. He tried to intimidate me. He tried to negotiate. When that didn't work, he tried to paint me as vindictive and unreasonable. His attorney sent letters suggesting I was being emotional and irrational. They offered to bump the settlement to $200,000, then $500,000, then $1 million. Patricia sent back a single-line response each time. See you in court. The trial was scheduled for January 15, 2024. As the date approached, Patricia delivered some unexpected news. She was going to be out of the country, her daughter was getting married in London, and the wedding had been planned for over a year. She tried to get the trial date moved, but DeAndre's legal team opposed any delays, probably hoping that her absence would work in their favor. Patricia offered to send one of her associates, but I made a decision that surprised even her. I'll represent myself, I said. She looked at me like I'd grown a second head. Yvette, I know you have legal experience, but this is different. DeAndre's team will eat you alive. They'll use every trick in the book. Let them try, I'd replied. I know this case better than anyone. I lived it, and I've spent enough time in courtrooms to know how they work. Plus, there's something powerful about a wrong spouse standing up for herself. The jury will see that. Patricia was skeptical, but she agreed to help me prepare. We spent 2 weeks doing mock trials, anticipating every argument DeAndre's team might make, preparing counter-arguments, and organizing evidence. I studied Georgia divorce law until I could recite statutes in my sleep. I practiced my opening statement 50 times until it was perfect. I was ready for battle. Which brings us back to that courtroom, January 15th, 2024, 9 o'clock in the morning. Judge Raymond Cooper presiding. The courtroom was packed. Apparently, word had gotten around that this was going to be an interesting case. DeAndre sat at the defendant's table with his lead attorney, Malcolm Hendricks, a silver-haired partner at one of Atlanta's most prestigious firms. Next to them were 2 junior associates and a paralegal, all of them looking polished and confident. DeAndre wore a navy suit with a red power tie, every inch the successful businessman. And then there was me, alone at the plaintiff's table, wearing a black pantsuit I'd bought specifically for this trial. No legal team, no backup. Just me, my briefcase, and 3 large accordion folders full of evidence. When I walked in and took my seat, I heard the whispers. I felt the stares. And when DeAndre saw that I was by myself, that Patricia wasn't coming, he leaned over to his attorney and laughed. Actually laughed, like this was already over, like I was a joke. Judge Cooper entered and we all stood. He was a no-nonsense jurist in his early 60s, with a reputation for running a tight courtroom and having zero patience for games. He looked at me, then at DeAndre's team, and raised an eyebrow. Ms. Chambers, he said, I'd already gone back to using my maiden name, I see you're representing yourself today. Are you certain you want to proceed without counsel? Yes, Your Honor, I replied, my voice steady and clear. I'm certain. He nodded, made a note, and we began. Malcolm Hendricks stood up for his opening statement, and it was exactly what I expected. He painted DeAndre as a self-made success story, a man who'd built an empire through hard work and determination. He acknowledged that the marriage was ending, but insisted that DeAndre had been more than fair in his offers. He suggested that I was bitter about the divorce and was now trying to use the legal system to punish my ex-husband for moving on. He talked about the prenuptial agreement like it was the Constitution itself, unbreakable and absolute. Your Honor, Hendricks concluded, Mr. Mitchell wants to move forward with his life. He's offered Ms. Chambers, a generous settlement that exceeds what the prenuptial agreement requires. But instead of accepting this olive branch, she's chosen to waste the court's time with baseless accusations of fraud and hidden assets. We ask that you honor the prenuptial agreement that both parties signed willingly and put an end to these proceedings. Then it was my turn. I stood up, walked to the center of the courtroom, and looked at each person in that jury box. I'd practiced this moment in my bathroom mirror 100 times, but now that it was real, I felt a surge of adrenaline that made every nerve in my body come alive. Your Honor, members of the jury, I began. My name is Yvette Chambers. 15 years ago, I married a man I thought was my partner. Together we built something. Not just him, us. I worked beside him. I sacrificed for him. I believed in him. And in return, he betrayed me. Not just emotionally, but financially. He systematically moved assets that we accumulated during our marriage, assets I helped create, out of my reach. He thought I wouldn't notice. He thought I wouldn't care. He thought I was too trusting, too naive, too small to stand up for myself. I turned and looked directly at DeAndre. His smirk had started to fade. But I'm not small. I'm not naive. And I'm not going anywhere until justice is served. Over the next few days, I'm going to show you exactly what my husband did. I'm going to prove that he violated his fiduciary duty to me as his spouse. I'm going to prove that he hid millions of dollars in assets. And I'm going to prove that the prenuptial agreement he's hiding behind should be thrown out because it was obtained through fraud and doesn't account for the assets we built together during our marriage. I pulled out the first exhibit, a blown-up copy of one of DeAndre's emails to his attorney. I placed it on an easel where the entire courtroom could see it. This is an email from DeAndre Mitchell to his attorney, dated September 28, 2023. In it, he writes, and I quote, "Need to move quickly before Yvette catches on." Catches on to what, you might ask? Catches on to the fact that he was stealing from me, that he was hiding assets, that he was planning to leave me with almost nothing while he rode off into the sunset with his mistress and the fortune we built together. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Cooper banged his gavel once, just once, and silence fell immediately. DeAndre's face had gone from amused to pale. Malcolm Hendricks was frantically writing notes, and I was just getting started. Malcolm Hendricks shot to his feet before I could continue. "Objection, Your Honor. These emails were obtained without proper authorization. Ms. Chambers accessed Mr. Mitchell's private computer and email account without permission. This is a clear violation of privacy, and any evidence obtained through such means should be inadmissible." I didn't even flinch. I'd anticipated this exact argument, and Patricia and I had spent hours preparing for it. Judge Cooper looked at me expectantly. "Your Honor," I said calmly, "the computer in question was located in the marital home in a shared office space. Georgia law is clear that spouses have equal access to marital property in shared spaces. Furthermore, these emails pertain directly to marital assets and the dissolution of our marriage, matters in which I have every legal right to be informed. Mr. Mitchell wasn't discussing privileged attorney-client matters related to unrelated business dealings. He was discussing how to hide my assets from me. There's a significant difference." Judge Cooper leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. "Mr. Hendricks, was this computer password protected or otherwise secured in a manner that would indicate Mr. Mitchell had a reasonable expectation of privacy from his spouse?" Hendricks hesitated for just a moment too long. "Your Honor, the computer had a screensaver." "That's not what I asked," Judge Cooper interrupted. "Was it password protected in a way that prevented Ms. Chambers from accessing it?" "The screensaver? There was no password requirement to wake it from sleep mode," Hendricks admitted reluctantly. "Then the objection is overruled," Judge Cooper declared. "The computer was in a shared marital space with no active security measures preventing spousal access. Ms. Chambers, you may continue." The first small victory. I saw DeAndre lean over and whisper something heated to Hendricks, who put up a hand to quiet him. I turned back to the jury, several of whom were now leaning forward with interest. "As I was saying," I continued, placing another exhibit on the easel, "this email is just the beginning. Over the course of this trial, I will present evidence of 19 separate asset transfers totaling $32 million. Transfers that occurred between January 2023 and October 2023. Properties purchased under shell company names. Investment accounts moved to offshore holdings in the Cayman Islands. Business interests transferred to entities that, on paper, have no connection to DeAndre Mitchell, but in reality are completely controlled by him. I pulled out a chart that my forensic accountant had helped me create. It was a visual representation of the money trail, with arrows showing how funds had moved from legitimate joint accounts into increasingly obscure corporate structures. The jury members' eyes widened as they took in the complexity of the scheme. Mitchell Development Group appears to be worth approximately $8 million on paper, I explained. But through a series of subsidiary companies and holding corporations, the actual value of the business and its holdings is closer to $43 million. And every single one of these transfers happened during our marriage, using capital and resources we accumulated together. But somehow, according to Mr. Mitchell, I'm entitled to none of it. I let that statement hang in the air for a moment before continuing. Your Honor, members of the jury, I'm not here because I'm bitter about a failed marriage. I'm here because I refuse to be erased. I refuse to let 15 years of my life, my work, and my contributions be dismissed as if they never happened. And I refuse to let fraud and deception be rewarded simply because the person committing it has expensive lawyers. I returned to my table and sat down. The courtroom was completely silent except for the sound of the court reporter's fingers flying across her stenography machine. Judge Cooper made some notes, then looked up. Mr. Hendricks, you may call your first witness. The defense's strategy became immediately apparent. Hendricks called DeAndre to the stand first, clearly hoping to control the narrative. DeAndre walked to the witness stand with practiced confidence, his hand steady as he placed it on the Bible to be sworn in. He settled into the chair and smiled at the jury, that same charming smile that had won me over 16 years ago. Hendricks walked him through his background, his business history, his rags to riches story. It was all very rehearsed, very polished. DeAndre talked about growing up in a working-class neighborhood in South Atlanta, watching his mother work 2 jobs to keep the lights on. He spoke about his determination to build something, to create generational wealth, to be someone his community could be proud of. He was good, I had to give him that. Several jury members were nodding along sympathetically. Then Hendricks moved to the marriage. Mr. Mitchell, can you describe your relationship with Ms. Chambers during the early years of your marriage? It was good, DeAndre said, his voice taking on a wistful tone. Yvette was supportive. She believed in me when I was just getting started. I'll always be grateful for that. But as my business grew, we started to grow apart. She was focused on her career. I was focused on mine. We became more like roommates than spouses. It happens. People change. And when did you decide the marriage was over? Honestly, about 2 years ago. But I didn't want to hurt Yvette. I kept hoping we could find our way back to each other. Eventually, I realized we couldn't. That's when I consulted with an attorney about the best way to move forward. Mr. Mitchell, Ms. Chambers has made serious allegations about hidden assets and fraud. How do you respond to these claims? DeAndre shook his head sadly. It's not fraud to structure your business properly. Everything I did was on the advice of accountants and attorneys. The corporate restructuring she's calling fraud is standard practice for asset protection and tax efficiency. Any successful business person does the same thing. Yvette worked as a paralegal, so she has some legal knowledge, but she doesn't understand corporate finance or business strategy. She's looking at routine business practices and seeing conspiracies that don't exist. It was a good answer, dismissive enough to undermine my credibility without seeming overtly hostile. But it was also an opening I planned to exploit. Hendricks asked a few more softball questions, establishing that DeAndre had offered me generous settlements that I'd unreasonably rejected, before finally saying, "Your witness." I stood up, gathering my notes. This was the moment I'd been preparing for. I approached the witness stand slowly, maintaining eye contact with DeAndre. His confidence was still intact, but I could see a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Mr. Mitchell, I began, you testified that you decided the marriage was over approximately 2 years ago. That would be January 2022, correct? Around then, yes. And yet you didn't mention the marriage being over to me. In fact, in February 2022, we celebrated our 13th wedding anniversary. Do you remember that? DeAndre shifted slightly in his seat. Of course. We went to that bed and breakfast in Savannah, the one where we spent our honeymoon. You gave me a card that said, "To many more years together." Do you remember writing that? I pulled out the card. I'd saved it, like I'd saved every card and letter from our marriage. Hendricks started to object, but Judge Cooper waved him off. I remember, DeAndre admitted. So you were telling me you wanted many more years together. while simultaneously deciding the marriage was over. Is that correct? I, I was trying to preserve the relationship. I didn't want to give up. Or, I said, my voice sharpening, you were keeping me complacent while you moved assets out of my reach. Let's talk about those assets. You testified that the corporate restructuring was done for asset protection and tax efficiency. Is that correct? Yes. And who advised you to undertake this restructuring? My accountant and my corporate attorney. Would that be Gerald Simmons and Patricia Liu, respectively? Yes. And when did they first recommend this restructuring? DeAndre paused, calculating. I'd have to check my records. Allow me to help you, I said, pulling out another document. This is an email from Gerald Simmons to you, dated January 11, 2022. In it, he writes, DeAndre, I've reviewed your request for restructuring to move assets into protected entities. I want to be clear that while this is legal, the timing concerns me given your marital situation. If you're planning a divorce, these transfers could be viewed as fraudulent conveyances. I strongly advise waiting until after any divorce proceedings to make these moves. I looked up from the document. So your accountant explicitly warned you that these transfers could be considered fraudulent in the context of a divorce, and you proceeded anyway. Is that correct? Malcolm Hendricks was on his feet. Objection. Ms. Chambers is mischaracterizing the email. The accountant said the transfers were legal. Sustained, Judge Cooper said. Ms. Chambers, rephrase your question. Mr. Mitchell, did your accountant warn you that the timing of these transfers, given your marital situation, could be problematic? DeAndre's jaw tightened. He expressed some concerns about optics. Optics. Interesting word choice. Let's talk about specifics. In March 2022, you transferred a commercial property at 1450 Peachtree Street, a property worth approximately $4 million, out of Mitchell Development Group and into an entity called Cascade Holdings, LLC. Is that correct? That sounds right. And who owns Cascade Holdings, LLC? It's a holding company. Who owns it, Mr. Mitchell? I do, indirectly. Through how many layers of corporate structure? I don't recall exactly. Let me help you again. Cascade Holdings is owned by Peachtree Investment Partners, which is owned by MDG Holdings International, which is owned by Summit Ventures Group, which is ultimately owned by a trust registered in the Cayman Islands, with you as the sole beneficiary. 4 layers. Would you say that's accurate? DeAndre glanced at his attorney, who gave him a barely perceptible nod. That's approximately correct. So this property that we purchased together during our marriage, using funds from our joint accounts and income from our joint efforts, is now held in a structure so complex that it would take a forensic accountant weeks to trace it back to you. And you're telling this court that's just routine asset protection? It's standard practice. For people who are trying to hide assets from their spouses, yes, I agree. I didn't give him time to respond. Let's talk about another property. In June 2022, you purchased a beachfront condo in Miami for $2.3 million. Who did you purchase it under? Summit Ventures, another one of your shell companies, and this purchase was made 3 months after you decided our marriage was over. Did you ever mention this purchase to me? I don't recall. You don't recall spending $2.3 million? That seems like something memorable. Let me ask you this. Who stays in that Miami condo? For the first time, DeAndre looked genuinely uncomfortable. It's a rental property. Is it? Because according to the building's security logs, which I subpoenaed, there's a regular guest who stays there approximately twice a month, a woman named Simone Laurent. Does that name sound familiar? The courtroom erupted in whispers. Hendricks was on his feet shouting objections, but Judge Cooper was already banging his gavel. When order was restored, the judge looked at me sternly. Ms. Chambers, I'll allow this line of questioning, but tread carefully. Stick to the financial aspects. Yes, Your Honor. I turned back to DeAndre, whose face had taken on a reddish hue. Mr. Mitchell, Ms. Laurent is a real estate broker you've worked with, correct? Yes. And you've been in a romantic relationship with her since approximately April 2021, correct? That's irrelevant to the financial matters. Actually, it's very relevant because you've spent marital funds that should have been used for our household and our future, on this relationship. The Miami condo, a BMW you purchased in Miss Laurent's name, a joint vacation to Turks and Caicos that cost $40,000. All of this while you were still married to me, while you were telling me we needed to cut back on expenses, while you were asking me to sign papers removing my name from properties to save on taxes. Were you saving on taxes, Mr. Mitchell? Or were you preparing to cut me out entirely? DeAndre's composure was cracking. I provided for you. You never wanted for anything. You provided for me? My voice rose slightly, and I had to consciously rein it in. I provided for you. When you were starting out and couldn't make payroll, who loaned you $15,000 from her savings? When you needed someone to review contracts at 2 in the morning because you couldn't afford an attorney who did that work for free? When you were too stressed to sleep and needed someone to believe in you? Who was that person, DeAndre? You were, he said quietly. I was, and this is how you repaid me. By systematically stealing from me, lying to me, and then offering me a fraction of what I'm owed as if it were charity. I turned to Judge Cooper. No further questions? Your Honor. As I walked back to my table, I could feel the energy in the courtroom had shifted. The jury was no longer looking at me with skepticism. They were looking at DeAndre with disgust. One of the female jurors was shaking her head slowly, her arms crossed over her chest. A male juror in the back row was writing furiously in his notepad. Hendricks did his best to rehabilitate his client on redirect, but the damage was done. DeAndre had been exposed as not just unfaithful, but calculating and dishonest. Every answer he gave sounded defensive. Every explanation seemed rehearsed. By the time he stepped down from the witness stand, his earlier confidence had evaporated entirely. The defense called their financial expert next, a certified public accountant named Douglas Freeman, who had impressive credentials and absolutely no charisma. Freeman spent 2 hours walking the jury through complex corporate structures and tax strategies, trying to normalize everything DeAndre had done. To his credit, he was thorough, but he was also boring, and I could see several jury members struggling to stay engaged. When it was my turn to cross-examine Freeman, I kept it simple and direct. Mr. Freeman, you've testified extensively about legitimate reasons for corporate restructuring. I want to ask you about timing. In your professional experience, is it common for business owners to undertake major asset transfers immediately after consulting with a divorce attorney? Freeman adjusted his glasses. It can happen for various reasons. That's not what I asked. Is it common? Not particularly common, no. In fact, wouldn't you say that transferring assets shortly before or during divorce proceedings is exactly what judges look for when determining if someone is trying to hide marital property? That can be one interpretation. Mr. Freeman, you reviewed Mr. Mitchell's financial records for this case. Between January 2022 and October 2023, how many significant asset transfers occurred? Approximately 19. And in the 5 years prior to that period, 2017 through 2021, how many significant asset transfers occurred? Freeman consulted his notes. Approximately 4. So Mr. Mitchell's transfer activity increased by almost 500% during the exact period when he was planning to divorce me. Does that strike you as normal business activity or as someone trying to move assets beyond his spouse's reach? I can't speculate on intent. I'm not asking you to speculate on intent. I'm asking you, as a financial expert, whether this pattern of behavior is consistent with normal business operations or with someone attempting to hide assets in anticipation of divorce. Freeman shifted uncomfortably. It's consistent with the latter. Thank you, Mr. Freeman. No further questions. The defense rested their case by late afternoon on the second day of trial. Judge Cooper adjourned until the next morning, when I would present my case. As the courtroom emptied, DeAndre and his legal team huddled together in intense conversation. I packed my materials methodically, aware that several people were watching me. As I headed for the exit, a woman I didn't recognize approached me. Ms. Chambers, I'm Janelle Robertson, reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Would you be willing to comment on— No comment, I said firmly but politely. The case is still ongoing, and it wouldn't be appropriate for me to discuss it outside of court. She handed me her card anyway. When this is over, I'd love to hear your story. What you're doing in there, representing yourself against a team of high-priced lawyers It's remarkable. I took the card and gave her a small smile. If I win, we'll talk. That night, I didn't sleep much. I reviewed my witness list, my evidence, my planned questions. I'd called 4 witnesses for my side: the forensic accountant who'd traced DeAndre's asset transfers, a real estate appraiser who'd valued the properties DeAndre claimed were worth less than they actually were, a private investigator who documented DeAndre's relationship with Simone, and finally myself. Taking the stand was a calculated risk. It would give Hendricks a chance to cross-examine me. But I needed the jury to hear directly from me about what our marriage had been, what I'd contributed, and what DeAndre had taken. Day 3 began with my forensic accountant, Raymond Chen. Raymond was a numbers genius who'd worked on several high-profile white-collar crime cases. He was also unexpectedly charming, with a gift for explaining complex financial concepts in ways that ordinary people could understand. He walked the jury through each asset transfer, showing them exactly how DeAndre had moved money and property through various corporate entities. What Mr. Mitchell did here, Raymond explained, pointing to a flowchart he'd created, is create what we call a corporate veil. On the surface, everything looks separate. Different companies, different bank accounts, different ownership structures. But when you follow the money, you see that everything ultimately flows back to Mr. Mitchell. He controls all of it. It's like a shell game. The shells keep moving, but the ball never really goes anywhere. In your professional opinion, I asked, were these transfers made for legitimate business purposes? Some of them, possibly, but the timing and the pattern suggest a different motive. When someone moves $32 million in assets in less than 2 years, right after consulting with a divorce attorney, that's not coincidental. That's deliberate. Hendricks tried to shake Raymond's testimony on cross-examination, but Raymond was unflappable. He documented everything, backed up every assertion with data, and anticipated every question. By the time he stepped down, the jury looked like they'd just watched someone solve a complicated mystery. My real estate appraiser, Monica Whitfield, testified next. She'd independently appraised the properties DeAndre claimed were worth $8 million and determined their actual value was closer to $18 million. She brought photographs, comparable sales data, and market analysis. It was dry testimony, but it was damning. The private investigator, James Torres, was more colorful. A former police detective with 25 years of experience, he'd spent 3 months documenting DeAndre's movements and activities. He'd photographed DeAndre and Simone together at restaurants, hotels, and the Miami condo. He documented expensive gifts, romantic getaways, and intimate dinners, all funded with money that should have been marital assets. Mr. Torres, I asked, in your professional opinion, how long had Mr. Mitchell's relationship with Ms. Laurent been ongoing? Based on credit card receipts, travel records, and witness statements, I'd estimate at least 2 years, possibly longer. When Hendricks cross-examined Torres, he tried to argue that the relationship was irrelevant to the financial issues. Mr. Torres, isn't it true that infidelity doesn't affect property division in Georgia? That's correct, Torres replied. But when someone spends marital funds on an affair, it becomes relevant. Mr. Mitchell spent over $200,000 on Ms. Laurent during the course of their relationship, money that came from accounts that included Ms. Chambers' contributions. By the end of day 3, I'd presented a comprehensive case showing not just that DeAndre had hidden assets, but that he'd done so deliberately, systematically, and while carrying on an affair funded by marital money. The jury looked exhausted but engaged. Several of them were taking detailed notes. Day 4 was when I would take the stand myself. As I was sworn in that morning, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This was my moment to tell my story in my own words, to make the jury understand what this case was really about. It wasn't just about money or property. It was about dignity, respect, and refusing to be erased. I decided to examine myself using a technique Patricia had taught me, asking myself questions out loud and then answering them. It felt odd at first, but it allowed me to control the narrative completely. Ms. Chambers, I began, addressing myself formally, can you tell the court about the early years of your marriage to DeAndre Mitchell? I turned to the jury and spoke directly to them. When DeAndre and I got married in 2009, we had almost nothing. I was working as a legal assistant making $32,000 a year. He was trying to get his real estate business off the ground, but the economy was terrible. We lived in a tiny apartment in College Park. We shopped at thrift stores. We ate pasta 3 nights a week because it was cheap. But we were happy. We had dreams. We were building something together. I walked them through those early years, how I'd helped DeAndre review contracts, how I'd done legal research for free, how I'd given him my savings when he couldn't make payroll. I described the long nights when we'd sit at our kitchen table, planning his next project, strategizing about which properties to bid on, discussing how to grow the business. I wasn't just his wife, I said. I was his partner. Every decision we made together. Every property we bought as a team. When Mitchell Development Group started to succeed, it wasn't just his success, it was ours, together. I detailed how things changed as the business grew, how DeAndre became distant, how I trusted him when he asked me to sign documents I didn't fully understand. And then, I continued, my voice steady despite the emotion behind the words, I found the emails. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't looking for evidence of an affair. I simply walked into an unlocked office and saw my entire marriage, my entire life, laid out on a computer screen. And what I saw broke me. Not just the affair, though that was painful enough, but the calculated way DeAndre had planned to take everything we'd built and leave me with nothing. Like I'd never existed. Like 15 years of my life meant nothing. I paused, letting that sink in. Several jury members were leaning forward, completely focused on my testimony. I asked myself that night, what do I do? Do I confront him? Do I scream and cry and fall apart? Or do I fight back? And I chose to fight, because I refused to be erased. I refused to let anyone, husband, stranger, or otherwise, steal from me and call it business. What DeAndre did wasn't business, it was theft, it was betrayal, and it was wrong. When I finished my direct testimony, I returned to the witness stand and said, Your witness, Mr. Hendricks. Malcolm Hendricks approached with the wary expression of a man who knew he was walking into a minefield. His strategy became clear quickly. He was going to try to paint me as calculating and vengeful. Ms. Chambers, you testified that you weren't snooping when you accessed your husband's computer, but you also testified that you printed dozens of documents, saved them to multiple drives, and emailed them to yourself. That sounds quite thorough for someone who wasn't snooping. I was protecting myself, I replied calmly. Once I realized what DeAndre was doing, I knew I needed evidence. I'm not ashamed of that. When you discover that someone is stealing from you, you document it. That's not snooping, that's survival. You mentioned that you gave Mr. Mitchell $15,000 from your savings early in the marriage. Did you ever ask him to pay you back? No, it was a gift to support our joint future. That's what spouses do. They support each other. So you gave him money freely, without any expectation of repayment, and now you're claiming he owes you? Mr. Hendricks, there's a difference between giving someone support when your partner's building a life together and having that person systematically steal from you while planning to leave. Surely you can see that distinction. He moved on quickly. Ms. Chambers, you worked as a paralegal throughout your marriage, correct? Yes. And you earned your own income, had your own career, your own retirement accounts? Yes. So you weren't financially dependent on Mr. Mitchell. You could have left the marriage at any time. Financial independence doesn't mean I'm not entitled to my fair share of what we built together. I stayed in the marriage because I loved my husband and believed in our partnership. The fact that I had my own career doesn't give him the right to steal marital assets. Hendricks tried several more angles, suggesting I'd been planning this lawsuit for months before DeAndre filed for divorce, implying that my legal knowledge gave me an unfair advantage, even hinting that I'd manipulated the evidence somehow. But I'd anticipated every question, and I answered each one with calm, factual responses. After an hour, he gave up and sat down. Judge Cooper called a brief recess, and when we returned, it was time for closing arguments. Hendricks went first, and he did his best to salvage his case. He focused on the prenuptial agreement, arguing that it should be upheld regardless of what happened during the marriage. He suggested that my calculations of asset values were inflated and that DeAndre's corporate restructuring was legitimate. He even tried to generate sympathy by pointing out how difficult it must be for DeAndre to have his Personal life exposed in court. Mr. Mitchell made mistakes, Hendricks concluded. He had an affair. That was wrong, and he's not proud of it. But personal failings don't invalidate a prenuptial agreement or justify taking a man's entire life's work. Miskalka's Chambers wants to punish her ex-husband for falling out of love with her. Don't let her use this court as a weapon for revenge. Then it was my turn. I stood and walked to the center of the courtroom one final time. This was it. My last chance to make the jury understand what this case was really about. Members of the jury, I began, Mr. Hendricks just told you that I want to punish DeAndre Mitchell for falling out of love with me. That's not true. You can't punish someone for their feelings. People fall out of love. Marriages end. That's life. But this case isn't about hurt feelings or a broken heart. This case is about theft. It's about fraud. It's about a man who looked at his wife, his partner of 15 years, and decided she was worth less than nothing. I walked over to the evidence table and picked up the prenuptial agreement. Mr. Hendricks wants you to focus on this document. He wants you to believe that because I signed this paper 16 years ago, when I was young and in love and naive, I somehow gave up my rights to everything DeAndre and I built together during our marriage. But that's not how the law works. A prenuptial agreement doesn't give someone license to commit fraud. It doesn't give someone the right to hide assets. And it especially doesn't protect someone who obtained the agreement through deception. I held up another document. This is the financial disclosure DeAndre provided when we signed the prenup. According to this, his net worth in 2008 was approximately $100,000. Most of that was equity in a small rental property and some savings. The prenup was designed to protect that initial wealth he brought into the marriage. I never disputed that. What I dispute is his claim that the $43 million we accumulated during our marriage is somehow also protected by that agreement. I placed both documents back on the table and turned to face the jury directly. Over the past 4 days, you've heard testimony from forensic accountants, real estate appraisers, and investigators. You've seen emails, bank records, and corporate documents. All of that evidence points to one inescapable conclusion. DeAndre Mitchell systematically moved marital assets we built together, beyond my reach. He did this deliberately. He did this secretly. And he did this while lying to my face and asking me to trust him. I paused, making eye contact with each juror. The defense wants you to believe this was normal business practice, but his own accountant warned him not to do it. His own accountant told him these transfers would look like fraud in the context of a divorce, and DeAndre did them anyway. Why? Because he thought he could get away with it. He thought I was too trusting, too naive, too small to stand up for myself. He thought wrong. I walked back toward my table, then turned for my final statement. I'm not asking you to punish DeAndre Mitchell for having an affair. I'm not asking you to punish him for falling out of love. I'm asking you to look at the facts, apply the law, and give me what I'm entitled to, my fair share of the marital estate, half of what we built together. Not charity, not pity, just justice. Thank you. The courtroom was silent as I sat down. Judge Cooper instructed the jury on the relevant law, explaining how to evaluate evidence, how to determine what constituted marital property, and what standards they should use to decide if fraud had occurred. The jury was excused to deliberate at 3:15 in the afternoon. Now came the hardest part, waiting. I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, unable to leave in case the jury came back quickly. Patricia had warned me that deliberations could take hours or even days. Every minute felt like an eternity. I replayed every question I'd asked, every answer I'd given, wondering if I'd missed something crucial. Around 5:30, my phone buzzed. It was Patricia calling from London. "How did it go?" she asked, and I could hear wedding celebration sounds in the background. "I think I did okay," I said. "The jury is deliberating now. Hendricks tried his best, but I don't think they're buying what he's selling." "You were brilliant, weren't you?" "I was prepared. There's a difference." "Yvette, prepared is good, but brilliant wins cases. Call me the second you have a verdict, no matter what time it is here." "I will. Go enjoy your daughter's wedding." "I'm only enjoying it because I know you've got this." "You're a fighter, Yvette." That man picked the wrong woman to underestimate. At 6:45, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from the court clerk. Jury has reached a verdict. Judge Cooper wants everyone back in courtroom at 7 p.m. My heart started racing. Less than 4 hours of deliberation. That could be good or bad. There was no way to know. I gathered my things and headed back into the courtroom. DeAndre and his team were already there, all of them looking tense. DeAndre wouldn't meet my eyes. At exactly 7 o'clock, Judge Cooper emerged from his chambers. I understand the jury has reached a verdict. Please bring them in. The 12 jurors filed back into the jury box. I tried to read their faces, but they were carefully neutral. The forewoman, a black woman in her 50s who'd been taking copious notes throughout the trial, held a piece of paper. Madam Forewoman, Judge Cooper said, has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. Please hand your verdict to the bailiff. The bailiff walked the paper to Judge Cooper, who read it silently. His expression revealed nothing. He handed it back to the bailiff, who returned it to the forewoman. Please read the verdict, Judge Cooper instructed. The forewoman cleared her throat and began to read. In the matter of Chambers versus Mitchell, we the jury find as follows. First, regarding the prenuptial agreement, we find that the agreement is valid as to assets Mr. Mitchell possessed prior to the marriage, but does not apply to assets accumulated during the marriage through joint efforts and marital funds. I felt my hands start to shake. That was a huge win. The prenup couldn't protect what DeAndre had tried to hide. The forewoman continued. Second, we find that Mr. Mitchell engaged in fraudulent conveyance of marital assets with the intent to deprive Ms. Chambers of her rightful share of the marital estate. A small gasp went through the courtroom. DeAndre's face had gone ashen. Third, we find that the total value of the marital estate, including all properties, business interests, and financial accounts, is approximately $43 million. That was the exact number my forensic accountant had calculated. The jury had believed every word of my evidence. Fourth, we find that Ms. Chambers is entitled to 50% of the marital estate, totaling $21.5 million. I couldn't breathe. $21.5 million. Not the $50,000 DeAndre had offered. Not even the $1 million his attorneys had eventually proposed. $21.5 million. But the forewoman wasn't finished. Finally, given the egregious nature of Mr. Mitchell's fraudulent conduct and his bad faith attempts to hide marital assets, we award Ms. Chambers an additional $2 million in punitive damages, and we recommend that she be awarded all of her attorney's fees and costs associated with this litigation. The courtroom erupted. Judge Cooper banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. When silence finally fell, he looked at DeAndre with something that might have been disappointment or disgust. It was hard to tell. Mr. Mitchell, Judge Cooper said, the jury has spoken. Their verdict is sound and supported by overwhelming evidence. I'm going to enter judgment consistent with their findings. Additionally, I'm ordering a full accounting of all assets to ensure compliance, and I'm appointing a special master to oversee the transfer of funds and properties to Ms. Chambers. You have 30 days to begin liquidating assets if necessary to meet this judgment. Do you understand? DeAndre could barely speak. Yes, Your Honor. Furthermore, Judge Cooper continued, given the clear evidence of fraud presented in this case, I'm referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for review of potential criminal charges. Fraudulent conveyance is a serious matter, Mr. Mitchell. You're fortunate that this jury only had the power to award civil damages. Malcolm Hendricks looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. His junior associates were frantically packing up their materials, probably eager to escape. DeAndre sat frozen in his chair, staring straight ahead. Judge Cooper turned to me. Ms. Chambers, congratulations on a well-presented case. You represented yourself with skill and professionalism. The court wishes you well in your future endeavors. He banged his gavel one final time. This court is adjourned. As people started filing out, several jury members approached me. The forewoman shook my hand firmly. Ms. Chambers, I just want you to know, what you did in here was remarkable. My husband tried to pull something similar on me 20 years ago, but I didn't have the strength to fight back like you did. You're an inspiration. Another juror, a younger man, nodded in agreement. The evidence was overwhelming. We knew by the end of the first day that your husband was lying. The only question was how much you were entitled to. We wanted to make sure you got everything you deserved. I thanked them, my eyes filling with tears I'd been holding back for 4 days. As they left, I turned to gather my materials and found myself face to face with DeAndre. His attorneys had already left, and we were alone in the courtroom except for the bailiff who was discreetly organizing papers at the far end of the room. "Yvette," DeAndre said, his voice hollow, "you destroyed me." I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, no regret, just a profound sense of closure. "No, DeAndre, I didn't destroy you. I held you accountable. There's a difference. You destroyed yourself the moment you decided I was worth less than nothing. $23 million, that's going to cripple my business. I'll have to sell properties, liquidate investments. Then you'll understand how it feels to lose something you built. The difference is, you're losing it because of your own choices. I was almost erased because of yours." He shook his head, looking lost. "I never wanted it to end like this." "Then you shouldn't have stolen from me. You shouldn't have lied to me. You shouldn't have underestimated me." I picked up my briefcase and started walking toward the exit. As I reached the door, I turned back one more time. "Oh, and DeAndre, that $50,000 you offered me? I'm going to donate it to a legal aid foundation that helps women going through divorces. Consider it a gift, in your name." I walked out of that courtroom with my head high. Outside, the reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution was waiting with a camera crew. "Ms. Chambers, can we get a statement?" I paused, considering. Patricia had told me to be careful with the press, but I also knew that my story could help other women in similar situations. "I'll give you 5 minutes." The camera started rolling, and the reporter asked, "Ms. Chambers, you just won a $23 million judgment against your ex-husband, representing yourself against a team of experienced attorneys. How does it feel?" "It feels like justice," I said simply. "For too long, women have been told to accept less than they deserve in divorce settlements. We're told to be grateful for scraps, to not make a fuss, to just move on quietly. I'm here to tell every woman watching this, know your worth, document everything. Don't be afraid to fight for what's yours, and never ever let anyone make you feel small." What would you say to other women who are facing similar situations? I'd say, educate yourself. Learn about your finances, your assets, your rights. If you think something is wrong, trust your instincts. And if you need help, ask for it. There are resources available. Legal aid organizations, women's advocacy groups, pro bono attorneys. You don't have to go through this alone. But most importantly, I want women to know that you're stronger than you think. I stood in that courtroom by myself and won because I was prepared, because I knew my case, and because I refused to be intimidated. If I can do it, so can you. The interview lasted another few minutes before I politely excused myself. As I walked to my car, my phone started buzzing with messages. Friends I hadn't heard from in months, former colleagues, even my mother calling from Florida where she'd retired. Word was spreading fast, but there was one call I needed to make first. I dialed Patricia's number, and she answered on the first ring, despite it being after midnight in London. "Well," she demanded, "21.5 million in equitable distribution, 2 million in punitive damages, plus attorney's fees and costs. Judge Cooper referred the case to the DA for potential criminal charges." Patricia let out a whoop so loud I had to pull the phone away from my ear. "I knew it. I knew you'd destroy them. Yvette, do you understand what you just did? You took on a team of elite attorneys with decades of experience, and you beat them. You didn't just win, you dominated." "I had a good teacher," I said, smiling, despite the tears rolling down my face. "You had good instincts and the courage to trust them. That's all you, sweetheart. All you." We talked for a few more minutes before Patricia had to return to the wedding reception. After we hung up, I sat in my car in the parking garage, letting the reality of what had just happened wash over me. 4 months ago, I'd been a woman facing the end of her marriage with almost nothing. Now I was a woman with $23 million, her dignity intact, and a future full of possibilities. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The story went viral. "Woman represents herself in divorce, wins $23 million, was the headline that appeared on news sites across the country. I was invited to speak at women's organizations, law schools, and advocacy groups. Media outlets wanted interviews. A literary agent reached out about writing a book. It was overwhelming and humbling in equal measure. The special master appointed by Judge Cooper worked efficiently to inventory DeAndre's assets and facilitate the transfer. Some properties had to be sold to raise the necessary cash, which took time, but within 6 months the full judgment had been paid. I used some of the money to pay Patricia's firm. Even though I'd represented myself, she'd done hundreds of hours of work preparing me for trial. The rest I invested carefully, setting myself up for genuine financial independence. I also made good on my promise to donate to legal aid organizations. I established the Yvette Chambers Foundation with an initial endowment of $2 million, focused on providing legal support and resources to women going through high-asset divorces. The foundation would pay for forensic accountants, expert witnesses, and in some cases, attorney's fees for women who couldn't afford quality representation. As for DeAndre, I heard through mutual acquaintances that his relationship with Simone Laurent fell apart within months of the trial. Apparently, she was less interested in him once his financial situation became complicated. He sold Mitchell Development Group to a competitor for a fraction of what it was worth at its peak. The last I heard, he'd moved to Charlotte and was working as a project manager for someone else's firm. The empire he'd built, that we'd built, was gone. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall. If anything, I felt a strange kind of pity. He'd had everything: a partner who loved him, a successful business, a bright future, and he'd thrown it all away because of greed and arrogance. He could have shared success with me. Instead, he chose deception, and it cost him everything. 6 months after the trial, I received an unexpected letter. It was from a woman named Keisha Williams, who'd been going through her own difficult divorce. She'd seen my story on the news and had been inspired to fight for herself instead of accepting the settlement her ex-husband's attorneys were pushing. With the help of resources from my foundation and her own determination, she'd won a judgment that reflected her true contributions to her marriage. The letter thanked me for showing her that it was possible to stand up for herself. That letter meant more to me than the $23 million. It meant that my struggle had mattered beyond just my own situation. It meant that other women were finding their courage, trusting their instincts, and refusing to be erased. A year after the trial, I was invited to speak at the Georgia Association for Women Lawyers annual conference. As I stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of female attorneys, law students, and paralegals, I thought about that moment in the courtroom when DeAndre had laughed at me. He'd seen a woman standing alone and assumed she was weak. He'd looked at 15 years of partnership and decided it was worth nothing. He'd made the fatal mistake of underestimating someone simply because she wasn't surrounded by a team of expensive suits. "Ladies," I said to the assembled crowd, "I'm not an attorney. I'm a paralegal who got angry enough to learn how to fight for herself. But what I learned during that trial is that knowledge is power, preparation is essential, and courage is contagious." When I stood up in that courtroom by myself, I was terrified, but I was also determined. And determination, backed by facts and evidence and the truth, is an unstoppable force. I paused, looking at the faces watching me. Some of you in this room will represent women like me. Women who've been betrayed, who've been stolen from, who've been told they're worth less than they are. When you take on those cases, remember that you're not just fighting for a settlement or a judgment. You're fighting for someone's dignity. You're fighting for justice. And you're showing women everywhere that they don't have to accept being erased. The applause was thunderous. After my speech, dozens of women lined up to talk to me, to share their own stories, to thank me for giving them hope. It was humbling and empowering in equal measure. Now, 2 years after that trial, I've rebuilt my life completely. I still work as a paralegal. I love the work too much to give it up. But I also run my foundation and speak regularly about financial literacy and legal rights in divorce. I bought a beautiful townhouse in Virginia Highland, travel when I want to, and wake up every morning grateful for the freedom to live life on my own terms. I'm often asked if I have any regrets about how things played out. The honest answer is no. Not about fighting, not about exposing DeAndre's fraud, not about standing up for myself. The only regret I have is that I trusted too easily for too long. But even that regret is tempered by the knowledge that trust isn't weakness. Betraying trust is. I'm not responsible for DeAndre's choices. I'm only responsible for my own response to those choices, and I'm proud of how I responded. Last month, I ran into Malcolm Hendricks at a legal conference in downtown Atlanta. He looked uncomfortable when he saw me, but he approached anyway. "Ms. Chambers," he said formally, "I wanted to tell you, that was one of the best presented cases I've seen in 30 years of practice. You should consider going to law school. You'd make an excellent attorney." I smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Hendricks, but I think I'm exactly where I need to be." As he walked away, I reflected on that courtroom 2 years ago. I thought about the laughter, the smirk, the absolute certainty in DeAndre's eyes that he'd already won. I thought about how that certainty had crumbled as I systematically dismantled his lies with evidence, logic, and the simple power of telling the truth. The courtroom had fallen silent when DeAndre Mitchell laughed at me, but by the time I was finished, it was his world that had gone silent, and mine that was just beginning to speak. Justice isn't always swift. It isn't always easy. But when you fight for it with everything you have, when you refuse to be intimidated or silenced or erased, justice has a way of prevailing. My husband thought my standing alone in that courtroom made me vulnerable. What he didn't understand was that I'd never been stronger, because I wasn't just standing for myself. I was standing for every woman who'd ever been told she was worth less than she was, every woman who'd been betrayed by someone she trusted, every woman who'd been underestimated simply because she walked into a room without backup. His smirk didn't last long, but my voice is going to echo for a very long time.